Little did these corporate executives know they were about to humiliate the wrong veteran at this retirement party. The golden hour sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Marriott Grand Ballroom in downtown Seattle as guests began filtering in for Harold Mitchell's retirement celebration. The elegant venue overlooked Elliott Bay, where ferries glided peacefully across the water like white specks against the darkening sky. After 35 years with Pacific Northwest Financial Group, Harold was finally hanging up his suit and tie, and the company had spared no expense for his farewell. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables draped in crisp white linens, while servers in black vests moved silently between guests offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Near the back of the room, Chen adjusted his simple navy blazer and checked his phone for the third time. At 38, the former Marine Staff Sergeant looked younger than his years, though his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen more than most. His blazer, purchased from a department store clearance rack, stood in stark contrast to the designer suits surrounding him. He'd served 3 tours in Iraq before transitioning to civilian life 5 years ago, and tonight he was here as Harold's personal guest. The old man had been his mentor during those difficult first months after leaving the military, when every job interview felt like an interrogation and every rejection stung a little deeper. Marcus had met Harold at a veterans job fair where the financial executive was volunteering his Saturday morning. While other employers had politely declined his applications, citing his lack of corporate experience or questioning gaps in his resume, Harold had seen something different. He'd spent 2 hours talking with Marcus about leadership, problem-solving, and the unique perspective that military service brings to civilian challenges. Over the following months, Harold had helped Marcus navigate the confusing world of corporate culture, reviewed his resume countless times, and most importantly, never made him feel like his military service was somehow a liability to overcome. As Marcus scanned the room, his military training kicked in automatically. He noted the 3 exit points, assessed the crowd dynamics, observed how conversations naturally clustered around the bar and appetizer stations, and mentally mapped the room's layout. These habits had kept him alive overseas during convoy runs through hostile territory, and 5 years of civilian life hadn't dimmed those instincts. What the well-dressed executives around him didn't know was that Marcus had been extremely busy during his transition to civilian life, working on something that would shock them all. While taking various temp jobs to pay the bills, construction work that left his hands rough and warehouse shifts that started before dawn, Marcus had been developing something revolutionary in his cramped garage. Late nights after 10-hour construction shifts, weekends between warehouse gigs, he'd been coding, testing, and refining an idea that had come to him during his last deployment in Fallujah. He'd watched military supply chains operate with precision under impossible conditions and realized that civilian companies were decades behind in logistics efficiency. His software could revolutionize supply chain management for major corporations, and after 3 years of development, it was finally ready. The energy in the room shifted dramatically as 3 senior executives from Pacific Northwest Financial made their grand entrance near the main doors. Richard Blackwood, the vice president of operations, commanded immediate attention with his perfectly tailored Italian suit that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. His silver hair was styled to perfection, and his Rolex caught the chandelier light as he gestured while speaking. Behind him followed his lieutenant, Jonathan Sterling, a Harvard MBA who treated networking events like military campaigns he'd never actually fought in. His handshake was practiced, his smile calculated, and his business cards were always perfectly positioned in his jacket pocket. The third member of their group was Amanda Pierce, the director of human resources, whose icy smile could freeze champagne and whose reputation for dismissing candidates based on first impressions was legendary throughout the company. They moved through the crowd like apex predators, collecting business cards and dropping names with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. These were the kind of people who measured success exclusively in quarterly reports and corner offices, who spoke fluently in corporate buzzwords and considered anything outside their narrow world completely irrelevant. Richard's laugh was too loud, Jonathan's networking too aggressive, and Amanda's judgments too quick and harsh. Marcus was quietly studying the peaceful harbor view through the massive windows when Harold approached with his characteristic warm smile, his arm around the shoulders of a young woman who appeared to be in her mid-20s. Her confident posture and intelligent eyes immediately reminded Marcus of Harold's thoughtful nature. Marcus, I'd like you to meet my daughter, Sarah. She just graduated from Wharton's business school and is starting her own consulting firm. Harold's pride was unmistakable in his voice, the same tone he'd used when talking about Marcus's achievements over the years. Sarah, this is Marcus Chen, the young man I've been telling you about constantly, one of the finest people I've ever had the privilege to know, and someone who's going to surprise a lot of people very soon. As they shook hands, Sarah's grip was firm and confident, her smile genuine rather than the practiced corporate version he'd grown accustomed to seeing. Dad's told me so much about you over the years. Thank you for your service to our country. What are you working on these days? Dad mentioned you've been developing something interesting. Before Marcus could answer properly, Harold spotted someone across the room and his expression brightened considerably. Excuse me, you two. The mayor just arrived with the city council, and I really need to say hello. Marcus, we'll catch up properly later tonight, okay? I have some news to share with everyone. Harold's eyes twinkled with barely contained excitement as he squeezed Marcus's shoulder affectionately. Left alone with Sarah, Marcus was about to explain his current projects when a shadow fell across their conversation. Richard Blackwood had materialized beside them like a storm cloud, his practiced corporate smile not quite reaching his cold eyes as he rapidly sized up the situation and made his immediate judgments. Well, what do we have here? Richard's voice carried that particular tone of corporate authority mixed with barely concealed condescension. His eyes swept over Marcus's department store blazer and scuffed shoes with the precision of a luxury car appraiser examining a used Honda. Sarah Mitchell, isn't it? Harold's daughter. I'm Richard Blackwood, Vice President of Operations. He extended his hand to Sarah while completely ignoring Marcus's presence. A deliberate power move he'd perfected over decades of corporate warfare. Sarah shook his hand politely, but her expression remained neutral. Nice to meet you, Mr. Blackwood. This is Marcus Chen, a close friend of my father's. She gestured toward Marcus, forcing Richard to acknowledge him. Richard's handshake with Marcus was brief and limp, the kind reserved for people he considered beneath his notice. Chen, right. And what is it that you do? The question came out like an accusation, as if Marcus's very presence at this upscale event required justification. Richard's eyes had already catalogued every detail of Marcus's appearance, from his simple haircut to his clearly off-the-rack outfit, and found them all lacking. I'm currently working on a technology project, Marcus replied calmly, his military training keeping his voice steady and professional. He'd learned long ago not to let civilians rattle him, especially ones who'd never faced anything more dangerous than a quarterly budget review. Jonathan Sterling appeared at Richard's shoulder as if summoned, his Harvard ring catching the light as he adjusted his gold cufflinks. Technology project. Jonathan's laugh was sharp and dismissive. That's what everyone calls it these days when they're between real jobs, isn't it? Let me guess, another app idea? Maybe cryptocurrency? Everyone thinks they're the next Silicon Valley success story. His tone carried the arrogance of someone who'd never created anything but PowerPoint presentations and cost-cutting proposals. Amanda Pierce glided over to complete their corporate tribunal, her predatory smile fixed in place as she sensed an opportunity for sport. Oh, how charming! Another veteran trying to make it in the tech world. We see this all the time in HR. Her voice dripped with false sympathy. The transition from military to civilian work can be so challenging. Have you considered more traditional employment? There are excellent programs for veterans in manual labor, security work, that sort of thing. Marcus felt Sarah tense beside him, but he remained perfectly composed. Years of dealing with hostile situations had taught him patience. I appreciate the concern, he said quietly, but I'm quite content with my current path. Richard's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. Current path? That's an interesting way to describe unemployment. His voice carried across their small circle, loud enough for nearby guests to turn and notice the conversation. Tell me, Chen, what exactly do you do for income while you're working on this mysterious technology project? Uber driver? Food delivery? The circle of corporate executives closed tighter around Marcus, their body language deliberately excluding him while making him the center of their attention. It was a classic corporate intimidation tactic, and they executed it with the precision of a well-rehearsed performance. Actually, Jonathan chimed in, pulling out his phone with theatrical flourish, I'm curious about this technology project. What's your company called? Maybe we've heard of it. I follow all the major tech startups, you know. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Series A funding, venture capital, that whole scene. His fingers moved across his screen as if he were about to Google Marcus's credentials on the spot. Company? Amanda's laugh tinkled like broken glass. Jonathan, you're being generous. Most of these garage entrepreneurs never get beyond the dreaming stage. It's quite sad, really. We get their resumes all the time. Former military, no corporate experience, convinced they're going to revolutionize some industry they don't understand. Sarah started to speak up, but Richard cut her off with a dismissive wave. Please don't feel obligated to defend him, dear. We understand your father's charitable nature. Harold's always had a soft spot for these hard-luck cases. Very admirable, really, but ultimately misguided. The conversation was drawing more attention now. Other guests had begun to notice the commotion, some moving closer with the irresistible attraction people have for witnessing social carnage. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, could sense the judgment and pity in their expressions as they took in his modest appearance versus the expensive suits surrounding him. The truth is, Richard continued, his voice growing more confident as their audience expanded, the business world isn't a charity case. It requires real education, real experience, real connections. You can't just decide you're an entrepreneur because you're tired of looking for actual employment. Jonathan nodded sagely, his Harvard education apparently qualifying him to speak on behalf of all successful business ventures. The failure rate for veteran-owned startups is astronomical, something like 90% fail in the first year. It's not their fault, really. The military doesn't teach business skills. Following orders isn't the same as leading a company. Marcus stood perfectly still throughout their verbal assault, his face betraying nothing. But something was changing in his posture, a subtle shift that Sarah noticed immediately. His shoulders squared slightly, his stance became more grounded, and there was a new quality in his eyes. It reminded her of her father's stories about watching Marcus handle difficult situations with quiet authority. So tell us, Amanda said with venomous sweetness, what's your backup plan when this little fantasy ends? Because it will end, you know. Reality has a way of catching up with dreamers. The crowd around them had grown considerably, drawn by the unmistakable scent of social blood in the water. Marcus could see the mixture of curiosity and pity in their faces as they witnessed what appeared to be a public dismantling of someone clearly out of their league. Some guests held their champagne glasses closer to their chests, as if protecting themselves from whatever social contagion Marcus might represent. Others whispered among themselves, probably wondering how Harold's guest had ended up so thoroughly outclassed at such an elegant event. Marcus took a slow, measured breath, the same technique he'd used before leading his Marines through hostile territory in Ramadi. Something fundamental shifted in his demeanor, though it was so subtle that only Sarah noticed it immediately. His spine straightened imperceptibly, his feet positioned themselves more firmly on the marble floor, and his hands, which had been casually at his sides, now rested with quiet confidence. The transformation was like watching a sleeping lion become aware of its surroundings. Gentlemen, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a new quality that cut through the ambient noise of the party like a blade through silk. And Ms. Pierce, his tone was respectful but carried an underlying steel that made several people in the immediate vicinity stop their conversations. I appreciate your concern for my future, but I think there might be some misunderstanding about my current situation. Richard's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He hadn't expected pushback from someone he'd already categorized as a defeated charity case. Misunderstanding? His voice carried that particular corporate tone reserved for employees who dared to question their superiors. I think we understand perfectly. You're unemployed, playing with some garage project and living off whatever savings you managed to accumulate during your military service. Jonathan stepped closer, emboldened by what he perceived as Richard's dominance in the exchange. Look, we're trying to help you here. Face reality. The business world isn't like the military, where everyone gets participation trophies. Results matter, connections matter, education matters. He gestured around the elegant ballroom filled with Seattle's business elite. This isn't the VFW hall. These are serious people doing serious business. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Sarah saw something flash behind his eyes that reminded her of every war movie she'd ever watched. The comparison to a VFW hall wasn't just dismissive of Marcus personally, it was an attack on every veteran who'd served their country and then struggled to find their place in civilian society. Amanda sensed blood in the water and moved in for what she clearly believed would be the killing blow. "The truth is, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false maternal concern, "you're exactly the kind of case study we discuss in HR seminars. Former military, unrealistic expectations, resistance to traditional employment structures. It's textbook, really. You probably spent months applying for positions you weren't qualified for, getting rejected, and now you've retreated into this fantasy world where you're some kind of tech entrepreneur." The circle of corporate predators was now complete, with Marcus at the center like a defendant facing a tribunal. Richard leaned in slightly, his expensive cologne mixing with the scent of his post-dinner scotch. "Here's what's going to happen, Chen. You're going to accept that this little experiment of yours is over. Tomorrow morning you're going to start applying for real jobs, security guard positions, warehouse work, maybe something in maintenance. Stop embarrassing yourself, and stop wasting Harold's time with these delusions of grandeur." Marcus stood perfectly still for a long moment, his eyes moving slowly from one face to another. The Marines had taught him to assess threats quickly and accurately, and what he saw in these corporate warriors was something he'd encountered many times before in different forms. Bullies who'd never faced real consequences for their actions, people who mistook privilege for strength and position for character. "I want to give you an opportunity," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a conversational level but somehow carrying clearly to everyone in their growing circle. "One chance to step back from this conversation and walk away. Return to your networking, enjoy Harold's party, and we can all pretend this exchange never happened." Richard's laugh was sharp and incredulous. "Are you threatening us? That's rich. What are you going to do, file a complaint with HR? Oh wait, that's Amanda right there." He gestured toward Amanda Pierce, whose smile had become positively predatory. Jonathan pulled out his phone again, this time with genuine malice in his eyes. "Actually, you know what? I'm curious enough to do some real research. What's your full name again? Marcus Chen? Let me see what Google has to say about your impressive business empire." His fingers moved across the screen with theatrical precision, clearly intending to expose Marcus's lack of any legitimate business presence in front of their audience. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that this social execution was reaching its climax. Marcus could feel their anticipation, their hunger for witnessing someone's complete humiliation. These were people who lived for moments like this, when the social hierarchy was reinforced through public demonstration. "Last chance," Marcus repeated, his voice carrying the same quiet authority he'd used when giving final warnings to insurgents who'd approached his checkpoints in Iraq. It was the voice of someone who'd been tested under fire and emerged stronger. "Walk away now." Amanda's laughter tinkled through the air like crystal breaking. "Or what? You'll send us a strongly worded email from your garage office?" The sound system crackled to life with a brief squeal of feedback that cut through the ballroom's ambient noise like a knife. Every conversation stopped as guests turned toward the small stage where Harold Mitchell stood behind the microphone, his face glowing with barely contained excitement. The elderly executive had changed into a fresh suit for his speech, and his usually modest demeanor had been replaced by something that resembled barely controlled joy. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please," Harold's voice boomed across the elegant ballroom, causing the crowd around Marcus to reluctantly shift their focus from their social execution to the guest of honor. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate not just my retirement, but what I consider to be one of the most exciting moments of my career." Richard, Jonathan, and Amanda exchanged glances, clearly annoyed that their public humiliation of Marcus was being interrupted by what they assumed would be a typical retirement speech filled with corporate platitudes and tearful goodbyes. The crowd began moving toward the stage, but the corporate trio remained firmly planted around Marcus, unwilling to let their prey escape before they'd finished their social dismantling. "Before I talk about my journey with Pacific Northwest Financial," Harold continued, his voice carrying an unusual energy that made even the most distracted guests stop their side conversations, "I want to share something that represents the future of business innovation, something that's going to change how we think about supply chain management forever." Marcus felt his stomach tighten slightly. He'd told Harold about his project in confidence during their mentoring sessions, never imagining that the old man would make it part of his retirement celebration. Sarah noticed Marcus's expression change and touched his arm gently, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "5 years ago, I met a young Marine veteran at a job fair," Harold said, his voice warming with genuine affection. "While other employers were looking at his resume and seeing gaps, I saw leadership, innovation, and the kind of practical problem-solving that only comes from real-world experience under pressure. That veteran is here with us tonight. Jonathan's phone was still in his hand, Google search results displayed on the screen, but his attention was now reluctantly drawn to Harold's speech. "This is probably about some charity program," he muttered to Richard. "You know how Harold gets sentimental about his veteran projects." Amanda nodded dismissively. "Probably announcing some scholarship fund or mentorship program. Very touching, but hardly relevant to our conversation." She turned back toward Marcus with renewed malice. "Now, where were we?" "Oh yes, your imaginary technology company." Harold's voice rose with increasing excitement. This young man didn't just find a job after leaving the military. He didn't just adapt to civilian life. He identified a problem that billion-dollar corporations couldn't solve and spent 3 years developing a solution in his garage, working construction jobs during the day, coding late into the night, testing and refining until he created something revolutionary. The ballroom had gone completely quiet now. Every guest focused on Harold's words. Even the servers had stopped moving, standing motionless with their trays as they listened to the unusual retirement speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harold announced, his voice now carrying across the silent ballroom like a victory bell, "I'm proud to announce that Pacific Northwest Financial Group has just completed the acquisition of LogiSync Technologies for $250 million. And I'm even more proud to introduce you to the founder and CEO of LogiSync Technologies, Marcus Chen." The silence that followed was so complete that the only sounds in the ballroom were the distant hum of the air conditioning and the faint noise of Seattle traffic 20 floors below. Then, like a dam bursting, the entire room erupted into applause and conversation as guests processed what they'd just heard. Richard's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if they weren't so devastating to witness. Confusion gave way to disbelief, which morphed into comprehension, and finally settled into the pale horror of someone realizing they'd just made a career-ending mistake. Jonathan's phone slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering on the marble floor as the Google search results for Marcus Chen LogiSync filled the cracked screen with headlines about the biggest tech acquisition of the year. Amanda's practiced corporate smile froze on her face like a death mask as she processed the implications of what had just happened. She'd just publicly humiliated a man who was now worth more than most of the company's senior executives combined. Worse, she'd done it in front of dozens of witnesses, including several board members and the mayor of Seattle. The crowd around them had transformed from voyeurs enjoying a social execution into shocked witnesses of corporate suicide. Guests who had been watching Marcus's humiliation with entertained pity were now staring at Richard, Jonathan, and Amanda with the kind of horrified fascination typically reserved for natural disasters. Sarah squeezed Marcus's arm, her eyes bright with pride and vindication. "Dad told me he had a surprise tonight, but I never imagined this." Her voice was soft with wonder. $250 million. "Marcus, that's incredible." Marcus remained perfectly composed, though there was now a different quality to his stillness. It was no longer the patience of someone enduring an attack, but the calm confidence of someone who had just watched his enemies destroy themselves without him having to lift a finger. "The acquisition closes Monday morning," Harold continued from the stage, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned ballroom. "Marcus will be joining our board of directors, and LogiSync will revolutionize our supply chain operations across all divisions. This represents the largest single innovation investment in our company's history." The 3 corporate executives stood frozen in their circle around Marcus like statues in a museum exhibit titled "How Not to Judge People." Their earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by the dawning realization that they had just publicly attacked someone who now held significant power over their professional futures. The ballroom's atmosphere had completely transformed from elegant networking event to the scene of a corporate earthquake. Guests who moments before had been enjoying Marcus's public humiliation were now frantically trying to distance themselves from Richard, Jonathan, and Amanda. Conversations buzzed with whispered recaps of what everyone had just witnessed, and more than one phone was discreetly recording the aftermath of what would undoubtedly become Seattle business legend. Marcus looked slowly at each of the 3 executives, his expression calm but carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only their immediate circle could hear, but it carried the authority of someone who had just been revealed as one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the Pacific Northwest. "Mr. Blackwood," Marcus said, addressing Richard directly. "Miss Pierce, Mr. Sterling, He paused between each name, letting the formal address sink in. "I believe you had some questions about my employment status." Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The man who had been so confident in his corporate dominance just minutes before now looked like he was trying to solve a mathematical equation that kept changing its variables. His expensive suit suddenly seemed less impressive when standing across from someone who had just been announced as the recipient of a $250 million acquisition. "Marcus," Richard started, then stopped, clearly realizing that anything he said at this point would only make his situation worse. The practiced corporate smooth-talking that had served him so well throughout his career had abandoned him completely in the face of this devastating reversal of fortune. Jonathan had bent down to retrieve his phone from the marble floor, and as he straightened up, the cracked screen displayed dozens of search results about LogleSync technologies. Headlines about revolutionary supply chain software and veteran entrepreneur's garage-to-billions success story glowed through the spiderweb of broken glass. His Harvard MBA suddenly felt like a participation trophy in comparison to Marcus's real-world achievement. Amanda's face had gone through several shades of pale as she processed the full implications of her situation. As Director of Human Resources, she had just publicly humiliated someone who would soon be sitting on the company's board of directors. Every word she had spoken, every dismissive comment about veterans and entrepreneurship had been witnessed by dozens of colleagues and superiors. Her career wasn't just in jeopardy, it was likely over. "You know," Marcus continued, his voice still conversational but carrying an undertone that made all three executives feel like they were standing on thin ice. "You were absolutely right about one thing. The business world does require education, experience, and connections." He gestured slightly toward the stage where Harold was still beaming with pride. "Harold Mitchell taught me that relationships matter more than assumptions, and that character is more valuable than credentials." Sarah stood beside Marcus, no longer trying to hide her smile as she watched the three corporate bullies struggle with their new reality. "I think my father saw something in Marcus that you three missed," she said, her voice carrying just enough edge to make her point clear. "Sometimes real leadership comes from unexpected places." The crowd around them was growing as more guests became aware of the drama unfolding. Board members, senior executives, and prominent Seattle business leaders were all witnessing the complete dismantling of three corporate careers in real time. Someone's phone camera flash went off, and Amanda visibly flinched as she realized this moment was being documented for posterity. From the stage, Harold's voice carried across the ballroom as he continued his announcement. "I want everyone to understand that this acquisition represents more than just a business deal. It represents what happens when we look beyond the surface, when we recognize potential instead of just pedigree, and when we understand that innovation comes from solving real problems with practical solutions." Richard made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Marcus, perhaps we can discuss this privately. I think there may have been some miscommunication." His voice trailed off as he realized how pathetic he sounded. There had been no miscommunication. Everyone had heard exactly what they had said, and no amount of corporate spin could change that reality. Marcus shook his head slowly. "I don't think there was any miscommunication at all, Mr. Blackwood. You expressed your opinions quite clearly. You believe that veterans are charity cases, that garage startups are fantasies, and that success requires the right background and connections." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The interesting thing is you were partly right about connections. They do matter. Harold connected me with the right investors, the right advisors, and ultimately the right acquisition partner." Jonathan's face had gone from pale to green as he realized the full scope of his mistake. "We didn't know," he whispered, though everyone could hear him in the suddenly quiet circle. "We had no idea who you were." "That's exactly the problem," Marcus replied, his voice carrying a note of disappointment rather than anger. "You didn't know, but you judged anyway. You saw a veteran in an off-the-rack suit and assumed you knew my entire story. You made decisions about my worth based on appearances and your own prejudices." Amanda finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "What are you going to do?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon, and everyone in their circle understood its implications. Marcus would soon have the power to end their careers with a simple conversation with the board. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from one face to another. The Marines had taught him that true strength was knowing when to use power and when to show mercy. These three had humiliated themselves more thoroughly than any revenge he could have planned. I'm going to do exactly what I came here to do tonight, Marcus said finally. Celebrate Harold's retirement and honor a man who saw potential where others saw problems. As for your futures with the company, that's not my decision to make, but I will say this: leadership isn't about judging people, it's about recognizing value wherever it comes from. The weight of his words settled over the three executives like a blanket of snow, cold and final. As the initial shock of Harold's announcement began to settle, the ripple effects spread throughout the ballroom like waves from a stone dropped in still water. The mayor of Seattle, who had been chatting with city council members near the bar, made his way through the crowd toward Marcus with the practiced efficiency of a politician sensing an important connection. Behind him followed several board members from Pacific Northwest Financial, their expressions ranging from impressed to calculating as they processed the implications of having a $250 million entrepreneur joining their ranks. Mr. Chen, the mayor, extended his hand with genuine warmth. Tom Bradley, mayor of Seattle. I have to say, this is quite an impressive evening. Harold tells me Logisync is going to be creating hundreds of jobs here in the city. We're always excited to support innovative companies that choose to stay local. Marcus shook the mayor's hand, his demeanor shifting effortlessly from the quiet authority he'd shown with the executives to the professional courtesy expected in political circles. Thank you, Mayor Bradley. Seattle has been good to me, and I'm committed to growing the company here. The talent pool from the University of Washington and the existing tech infrastructure make it an ideal environment for what we're building. Richard, Jonathan, and Amanda found themselves pushed to the outer edge of the conversation as more prominent figures gravitated toward Marcus. They stood like survivors of a shipwreck watching rescue boats sail past them toward someone else. The social dynamics that had seemed so fixed just 20 minutes earlier had been completely overturned, and they were discovering what it felt like to be irrelevant in a room where they had once commanded respect. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a board member and former tech executive herself, appeared at Marcus's elbow with a champagne flute and a knowing smile. "I've been following Logisync's patents for the past year," she said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who actually understood the technology behind the business. "The predictive analytics for supply chain disruption are remarkable. How did you solve the real-time data integration problem that Microsoft and Amazon couldn't crack?" Marcus's face lit up as he found himself in a conversation about the technical challenges that had driven him through those long nights in his garage. The key was approaching it from a military logistics perspective instead of a traditional business model. In Iraq, we had to adapt to constant supply disruptions with incomplete information. I realized that civilian supply chains were trying to prevent disruption instead of building systems that could adapt to it dynamically. The conversation around Marcus was becoming increasingly sophisticated as legitimate business leaders engaged with him on substantive topics. Meanwhile, Richard watched from a few feet away as his assumptions about military experience being irrelevant to business success crumbled before his eyes. Every word Marcus spoke demonstrated a depth of strategic thinking that Richard's MBA program had never taught him. Jonathan's broken phone had become a symbol of his shattered confidence. The device that he'd planned to use to expose Marcus's supposed fraud was now displaying article after article about Logisync's revolutionary approach to supply chain management. Forbes had called it the most significant advancement in logistics since the invention of the shipping container. Harvard Business Review had featured Marcus on their cover 3 months earlier with the headline, "From Marines to Millions, How Military Thinking is Revolutionizing Business." Amanda stood frozen in place, her mind racing through every company policy and procedure manual she'd ever memorized. There was no corporate guidance for what to do when you'd publicly humiliated someone who was about to become your boss. Her carefully cultivated professional reputation was evaporating in real time, and she could already see the whispered conversations and knowing looks that would follow her through the office corridors. Harold appeared beside the growing circle around Marcus, his face glowing with pride as he watched his protégé command the attention of Seattle's business elite. "I told you he was special," Harold said to Dr. Warren, though his voice carried far enough for the humiliated executives to hear. 5 years ago, I saw leadership qualities that most people miss. Marcus doesn't just solve problems, he sees problems that don't exist yet, and builds solutions before anyone realizes they need them. The elderly executive's words hit Richard like physical blows. Harold had been his mentor too, had guided his career for over a decade, and yet he'd never spoken about Richard with anything approaching the pride and affection in his voice when he talked about Marcus. The realization that he'd been professionally outclassed by someone he'd dismissed as a charity case was almost too painful to process. Sarah Mitchell moved through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting congratulations from family friends and business associates who remembered her from previous company events. She paused beside the three shell-shocked executives, her expression mixing pity with disappointment. "You know," she said quietly, her voice just loud enough for them to hear over the conversations around Marcus. "My father always taught me that the measure of a person isn't where they come from, but where they're going." Marcus never talked about money or success during our conversation tonight. He was asking about my consulting firm, interested in my plans, treating me like an equal even though he had no reason to believe I was anything more than Harold's daughter. Her words stung because they highlighted another layer of their failure. While they had been busy demonstrating their supposed superiority, Marcus had been showing genuine interest in others. The character traits that had made him successful in business were the same ones that had made him effective as a Marine leader, putting mission before ego, focusing on results rather than recognition, and treating people with respect regardless of their perceived status. The crowd around Marcus continued to grow as word spread through the ballroom about the evening's shocking revelation. Local tech entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and business journalists were all gravitating toward the man who had just pulled off one of the most significant business deals in Seattle's recent history. Each conversation revealed new layers of Marcus's expertise and vision, making the executive's earlier assumptions seem increasingly ridiculous in retrospect. Jonathan finally worked up the courage to approach the edge of the group surrounding Marcus, hoping to salvage something from the wreckage of his professional reputation. But as he got closer, he could hear Marcus discussing expansion plans, international markets, and strategic partnerships with a sophistication that made Jonathan's Harvard credentials feel like participation trophies. The evening that had started as Harold's retirement celebration had become Marcus Chen's coming-out party as a major player in Seattle's business community. And the three executives who had tried to humiliate him were learning a harsh lesson about the dangers of judging books by their covers. 3 weeks later, the conference room on the 35th floor of the Pacific Northwest Financial Building buzzed with an energy that hadn't been felt in years. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Elliott Bay sparkled in the morning sunlight, and the Seattle skyline stretched toward Mount Rainier in the distance. The mahogany table that had hosted countless board meetings was now covered with laptops, tablets, and architectural plans as Marcus Chen presented his integration strategy for Logisync Technologies. "The initial rollout will begin with our West Coast operations," Marcus explained to the assembled board members, his presentation flowing with the same confident authority he'd once used to brief commanding officers in Iraq. The cheap blazer from Harold's retirement party had been replaced by a well-tailored Navy suit, though he still wore the same American flag pin on his lapel. "We're projecting a 37% reduction in supply chain delays within the first quarter, with cost savings approaching $15 million annually." Board members leaned forward in their leather chairs, asking technical questions that Marcus answered with precision and depth. Dr. Elizabeth Warren nodded approvingly, as he explained the artificial intelligence algorithms that powered Logisync's predictive capabilities. The mayor's economic development team had sent a representative to observe the presentation, understanding that this acquisition could position Seattle as a major player in the logistics technology sector. Richard Blackwood sat at the far end of the table, his usual position as vice president of operations feeling increasingly tenuous with each passing slide. The man who had once commanded respect through corporate hierarchy now found himself struggling to follow Marcus's technical explanations. His attempts to ask relevant questions only highlighted his lack of understanding about the very supply chain processes he was supposed to oversee. "Mr. Blackwood," Marcus said, addressing Richard directly during the Q&A session, "you mentioned concerns about implementation timelines. Based on your experience with our current systems, what do you see as the primary bottlenecks we should anticipate?" The question was professional and respectful, but Richard felt the weight of every eye in the room as he struggled to formulate an intelligent response. His decades of corporate experience suddenly felt shallow compared to Marcus's combination of military logistics expertise and cutting-edge technology development. "Well, I think the usual integration challenges," Richard stammered, his answer so vague that several board members exchanged glances. Marcus nodded politely and moved on, but the moment crystallized something that everyone in the room had begun to realize over the past 3 weeks. The old corporate hierarchy was being quietly revolutionized by someone who understood both leadership and innovation in ways that traditional executives simply couldn't match. Down in the Human Resources Department, Amanda Pierce was discovering that reputation damage in Seattle's tight-knit business community was almost impossible to repair. Word of the retirement party incident had spread through professional networks like wildfire, helped along by the numerous phones that had captured various portions of the evening. Her attempts to schedule meetings with other companies had been met with polite deferrals and scheduling conflicts that never seemed to resolve. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, as Director of Human Resources, had created her own textbook case study in how not to treat people. The veteran employment programs she had once dismissed as charity work were now being expanded under direct orders from the board, with Marcus serving as an advisor. Every policy she helped implement felt like a reminder of her failure to recognize talent when it didn't fit her preconceived notions. Jonathan Sterling's situation was equally precarious. His Harvard MBA, once his calling card in Seattle's business circles, had become almost a liability in conversations about Logisync's innovative approaches. The traditional business models he'd memorized seemed outdated compared to Marcus's practical solutions to real-world problems. His networking attempts at industry events were met with knowing smiles and comments about the guy who tried to Google Marcus Chen's credentials. The technology sector moved fast, and stories of embarrassing mistakes move even faster. Jonathan found himself explaining the retirement party incident in job interviews, watching potential employers' expressions change as they realized he was the executive who had publicly humiliated one of the year's most successful entrepreneurs. His professional brand, carefully cultivated over years of strategic networking, had been destroyed in a single evening. Meanwhile, Marcus was experiencing the opposite trajectory. The business community that had once overlooked him was now seeking his insights on everything from veteran hiring practices to innovation strategies. Speaking engagements at the University of Washington's Business School led to guest lectures at Stanford and MIT. The garage entrepreneur who had been dismissed as unemployed was now being courted by venture capital firms and corporate boards across the country. Harold Mitchell, enjoying his retirement from his waterfront home in Bellevue, hosted a small dinner party for his former colleagues and their spouses. The conversation inevitably turned to the dramatic changes at Pacific Northwest Financial since Marcus's arrival. The old executive's satisfaction was evident as he watched his former protégé's success unfold exactly as he had predicted years earlier. "I knew Marcus had potential from our first conversation," Harold told his guests, raising his wine glass in a toast. "But even I underestimated how quickly he would transform not just our company but the entire industry. Sometimes the best investments are in people who don't fit the traditional mold." Sarah Mitchell, who had launched her consulting firm with Marcus as one of her first clients, was building a reputation for identifying unconventional talent in corporate environments. Her business model focused on helping companies recognize value in candidates who might not fit traditional profiles, and her success rate was attracting attention from major corporations across the Pacific Northwest. The retirement party that was supposed to be Harold's farewell celebration had become a watershed moment that reshaped careers, challenged assumptions, and demonstrated the dangerous cost of judging people by their appearances. In a city built on innovation and disruption, the story of Marcus Chen had become a cautionary tale about the importance of recognizing potential wherever it might be found. As Marcus wrapped up his board presentation and fielded the final questions from impressed executives, he couldn't help but think about that evening 3 weeks earlier when 3 corporate bullies had tried to humiliate him in front of Seattle's business elite. Their attempt to destroy his reputation had instead revealed their own character flaws and ultimately accelerated his recognition as a major force in the business community. The Marine who had been called unemployed was now reshaping the future of one of Seattle's most established financial institutions, and the executives who had attacked him were learning that in the modern business world, substance always trumps appearance. 6 months after Harold's retirement party, the Seattle Business Journal featured Marcus Chen on their cover with the headline, "From Combat to Commerce: How One Veteran is Revolutionizing Corporate America." The accompanying article detailed not just Logisync's remarkable success, but the broader cultural transformation happening at Pacific Northwest Financial Group under Marcus's influence as the youngest board member in the company's history. The changes were visible throughout the 35-story headquarters building. The executive floor, once dominated by traditional corporate hierarchies and closed-door meetings, now featured collaborative spaces where military veterans worked alongside MBA graduates, sharing perspectives that bridged practical experience with academic theory. Marcus had insisted that Logisync's integration team include veterans from all service branches, creating a talent pipeline that other Seattle companies were desperately trying to replicate. In the building's lobby, a new display honored employee military service, featuring photos and stories of the 43 veterans currently working throughout the organization. What had started as Marcus's quiet suggestion during a board meeting had evolved into a comprehensive veteran recruitment and development program that was being studied by corporate HR departments across the country. Richard Blackwood's corner office, once a symbol of his corporate authority, had been transformed into a collaboration space for the supply chain optimization team. Richard himself had accepted an early retirement package 2 months earlier, though the company's press release diplomatically described it as pursuing new opportunities. His departure came after a series of meetings where his inability to adapt to LogoSync's innovative approaches became increasingly apparent to everyone involved. The final straw had come during a client presentation where Richard had attempted to override one of Marcus's technical recommendations, only to demonstrate that he fundamentally misunderstood the logistics principles underlying their own business model. The embarrassment was witnessed by representatives from 3 major clients, and the subsequent loss of confidence from the board made his position untenable. Amanda Pierce's situation had evolved differently but no less dramatically. After months of struggling with the reputation damage from the retirement party incident, she had made an unexpected decision that surprised everyone who knew her corporate ambitions. She enrolled in a master's program in organizational psychology, focusing her thesis research on unconscious bias in hiring practices and the hidden costs of assumptions about veteran employment. Her transformation from the person who had dismissively suggested Marcus consider security work to someone studying the systemic barriers facing military veterans had been gradual but genuine. The research she was conducting revealed uncomfortable truths about how corporate America often wasted exceptional talent due to superficial judgments and cultural biases. Her preliminary findings were already being cited by other researchers in the field. Jonathan Sterling's trajectory had been the most precipitous of the 3. Unable to recover his professional reputation in Seattle's interconnected business community, he had relocated to Phoenix, where he hoped his Harvard credentials might carry more weight than his infamous misjudgment. However, even in a new market, the story of his confrontation with Marcus had followed him through professional networks and social media. His attempts to reinvent himself as a consultant specializing in traditional business practices had met with limited success, particularly as Marcus's innovative approaches were being adopted by companies nationwide. The Harvard Business Review article about LogoSync, which featured a sidebar about recognizing unconventional talent, had become required reading in MBA programs, serving as a case study in how traditional thinking could blind executives to revolutionary opportunities. Marcus, meanwhile, had leveraged his success into something far beyond personal achievement. The Marcus Chen Foundation, established with a portion of his acquisition proceeds, focused on supporting veteran entrepreneurs and providing bridge funding for innovative startups led by former military personnel. The foundation's first annual conference in Seattle had attracted venture capitalists, corporate executives, and military leaders from across the country. During his keynote address at that conference, Marcus had reflected on the journey from that humiliating evening at Harold's retirement party to his current position of influence. "The 3 executives who tried to shame me that night actually did me a tremendous favor," he told the audience of veterans and business leaders. "They forced me to articulate my value in ways I might never have done otherwise. Sometimes our greatest challenges become our most powerful platforms." The audience included several dozen veterans who had been inspired by Marcus's story to pursue their own entrepreneurial ventures. Many of them had faced similar dismissive attitudes from traditional corporate environments, and Marcus's foundation was providing both financial support and mentorship to help them navigate the complex transition from military service to business leadership. Harold Mitchell, now a senior advisor to the foundation, often spoke about the evening that had changed so many lives. "I invited Marcus to my retirement party to honor him," Harold would tell audiences at speaking engagements. "I never imagined that one evening would demonstrate so powerfully why our assumptions about people are often our greatest business liability." The retirement party had become a legend in Seattle's business community, referenced in leadership seminars and diversity training programs as an example of how quickly careers could be made or destroyed by a single moment of poor judgment. Business schools were using it as a case study in unconscious bias, and HR professionals cited it as a cautionary tale about the importance of cultural sensitivity and professional respect. Sarah Mitchell's consulting firm had grown into one of the most sought-after talent identification services in the Pacific Northwest, with a client roster that included Fortune 500 companies seeking to avoid their own retirement party moments. Her methodology for recognizing unconventional talent had been refined through hundreds of successful placements, proving that Marcus's story was not an anomaly, but rather an example of talent that existed throughout the veteran community, if organizations knew how to recognize it. The Seattle VA office had established the Marcus Chen Veterans Business Incubator, providing workspace, mentorship, and resources for former military personnel developing innovative business solutions. The program's success rate was attracting national attention and federal funding, with plans to replicate the model in cities across the country. As Marcus sat in his new office overlooking Elliott Bay, the same view that had provided the backdrop for his humiliation 6 months earlier, he reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him to this point. The garage startup that had been dismissed as unemployment had evolved into a platform for transforming how America's business community recognized and developed veteran talent. The phone call that interrupted his reflection came from the White House Office of Public Engagement, inviting him to participate in a presidential task force on veteran employment and entrepreneurship. The Marine who had been told to consider security work was now being asked to help shape national policy on veteran integration into the civilian economy. 1 year to the day after Harold Mitchell's retirement party, Pacific Northwest Financial Group hosted its annual Veteran Appreciation Gala in the same Marriott Grand Ballroom where everything had changed. The elegant venue looked remarkably similar, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over round tables draped in crisp white linens, but the energy in the room was completely transformed. Instead of corporate networking and polite conversation, the evening buzzed with stories of innovation, entrepreneurship, and second chances. Marcus Chen stood at the podium where Harold had made his stunning announcement 12 months earlier, but now he was the keynote speaker for an event that had drawn veterans, business leaders, and policymakers from across the nation. The American flag pin on his lapel caught the light as he looked out over an audience that included the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, 3 Fortune 500 CEOs, and dozens of veteran entrepreneurs whose businesses had been launched through programs inspired by his story. A year ago, in this very room, 3 executives told me I was unemployed and living in a fantasy world, Marcus began, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that had become his trademark. They weren't entirely wrong. I was living in a fantasy, but it wasn't the fantasy they imagined. I was fantasizing about a world where military experience was valued as a business asset, where innovation could come from unexpected places, and where character mattered more than credentials. The audience, which included several hundred veterans and their families, responded with knowing laughter and applause. Many of them had faced similar dismissive attitudes during their own transitions to civilian careers, and Marcus's story had become a symbol of possibility in a community that had often felt undervalued by corporate America. In the back of the ballroom, Harold Mitchell sat with his daughter Sarah, both of them beaming with pride as they watched the evening unfold. The old executive's decision to mentor a struggling veteran had evolved into something neither of them could have imagined. Sarah's consulting firm now employed 15 people and had expanded to 3 cities, helping companies identify and develop unconventional talent across multiple industries. The Marcus Chen Foundation has now supported over 200 veteran-owned startups, Marcus continued, his presentation flowing with the same precision he'd once used in military briefings. These businesses have created more than 3,000 jobs and generated over $150 million in revenue. But more importantly, they've changed the conversation about what veterans can contribute to American business. The statistics were impressive, but the human stories were even more powerful. In the audience sat Maria Rodriguez, a former Navy logistics specialist whose supply chain consulting firm had landed contracts with 3 major retailers. Next to her was David Kim, an Army medic whose healthcare technology startup had just closed a $10 million funding round. Each of them had faced their own version of the retirement party moment, and each had used Marcus's example as inspiration to persevere. Amanda Pierce sat near the middle of the ballroom, her presence marking one of the evening's most remarkable transformations. After completing her master's degree in organizational psychology, she had been hired by the Marcus Chen Foundation as Director of Research and Development. Her work on unconscious bias in hiring practices had become required reading for HR professionals nationwide, and her journey from corporate villain to advocate for veteran employment had become almost as famous as Marcus's original story. The most important lesson I learned that night, Amanda had told a reporter from Fast Company magazine, was that my assumptions about people were not just wrong, they were dangerous. When we dismiss someone based on their appearance or background, we don't just hurt them, we rob ourselves and our organizations of potentially transformative talent. Jonathan Sterling was notably absent from the evening's celebration. though his story had become an integral part of the cautionary tale that business schools now taught about professional judgment and career risk. His struggles to rebuild his reputation had continued even after relocating to Phoenix, where the Marcus Chen story had followed him through professional networks and industry publications. The Harvard Business Review had recently published a follow-up article titled The Lasting Cost of Professional Misjudgment, using Jonathan's experience as a case study in how quickly careers could be destroyed by poor character choices. The article had been downloaded over 100,000 times and was being used in MBA programs as a lesson in professional ethics and the importance of treating all people with respect. Richard Blackwood's early retirement had led to an unexpected second career as a cautionary speaker at corporate leadership conferences. His presentations focused on the dangerous cost of assumption-based leadership and the importance of recognizing talent regardless of its packaging. While his speaking fees were modest compared to his former corporate salary, he had found a certain redemption in helping other executives avoid the mistakes that had cost him his career. "I spent 30 years in corporate America believing that success looked a certain way," Richard would tell audiences. "It took one evening of being completely wrong about someone to teach me that real leadership means being humble enough to recognize when you don't know everything." Marcus concluded his keynote by announcing the foundation's newest initiative, a partnership with the Department of Defense to provide entrepreneurship training to military personnel during their final year of service. The program would help smooth the transition from military to civilian careers by identifying business opportunities and providing the resources necessary to pursue them. "The 3 executives who confronted me that night thought they were putting me in my place," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "What they actually did was force me to find my voice, to articulate my value, and to stand up for every veteran who has ever been told that their military experience doesn't translate to business success. Their attempt to diminish me became the catalyst for everything that followed." As the evening concluded with a standing ovation that lasted several minutes, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with such humiliation in this same room. The retirement party that was supposed to be Harold's farewell celebration had become the launching point for a movement that was transforming how America's business community recognized and developed veteran talent. The Marine who had been called unemployed had not only proven his worth but had created a platform that was helping thousands of other veterans prove theirs. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding confrontation, but from having the courage to stand up when others try to tear you down, and the wisdom to transform that moment into something larger than yourself. The ballroom that had witnessed his humiliation now celebrated his triumph, but more importantly, it celebrated the countless veterans whose stories were just beginning, inspired by the knowledge that character and determination could overcome any assumption or prejudice they might face. 5 years after that fateful retirement party, Marcus Chen stood in the Oval Office as the President of the United States signed the Veterans Innovation and Entrepreneurship Act into law. The legislation, which had been crafted with input from Marcus's task force recommendations, established federal funding for veteran business incubators in all 50 states, and created tax incentives for companies that hired veteran entrepreneurs in leadership positions. "This bill represents more than just policy," the president said, handing Marcus the ceremonial pen used to sign the legislation. "It represents a fundamental shift in how we recognize the value that our military veterans bring to American innovation and economic growth." The Marcus Chen Foundation's research has proven that veteran-owned businesses create jobs at twice the rate of traditional startups and have a 30% higher 5-year survival rate. The ceremony was attended by congressional leaders, cabinet members, and a delegation of veteran entrepreneurs whose success stories had helped build the political momentum for the legislation. Among them was Maria Rodriguez, whose supply chain consulting firm now employed over 200 people across 6 states, and David Kim, whose healthcare technology had been acquired by a Fortune 100 company for $500 million. Marcus's journey from that humiliating evening in Seattle to the halls of power in Washington, D.C., had been documented in business schools, featured in documentaries, and studied by organizational psychologists around the world. The Harvard Business Review had published 3 separate case studies analyzing different aspects of his story, from the initial corporate confrontation to the systematic transformation of veteran employment practices across American industry. Logisync Technologies, now a subsidiary of Pacific Northwest Financial Group, had expanded internationally and employed over 2,000 people in offices across North America, Europe, and Asia. The company's success had attracted acquisition offers exceeding $2 billion, but Marcus had chosen to keep the technology within the organization that had first recognized its value. Harold Mitchell, now serving as chairman emeritus, often joked that his retirement party had been the most expensive evening in corporate history. The ripple effects of that single evening continued to reshape careers and industries in ways that none of the original participants could have imagined. Amanda Pierce had completed her PhD in organizational psychology and established the Pierce Institute for Workplace Bias Research at the University of Washington. Her longitudinal studies on the cost of assumption-based hiring had influenced federal employment policy and saved American businesses an estimated $12 billion annually in reduced turnover and improved productivity. Her transformation from corporate villain to respected academic researcher had become a subplot in Marcus's story that resonated particularly strongly with HR professionals. "The night I told Marcus Chen to consider security work was the night I began questioning every assumption I'd ever made about talent identification," she wrote in her best-selling book, Hidden Potential: Why Our Worst Hiring Decisions Teach Us the Most About Leadership. Jonathan Sterling's cautionary tale had taken an unexpected turn when he chose to document his own failure in a memoir titled The Harvard Mistake: How Arrogance Cost Me Everything, and What It Taught Me About Success. The book had become required reading in several MBA programs as an example of how professional hubris could destroy promising careers. Jonathan now worked as a corporate consultant specializing in helping executives avoid the kind of judgment errors that had derailed his own trajectory. His speaking engagements at business conferences focused on humility, professional respect, and the dangerous cost of dismissing people based on superficial characteristics. While his consulting practice was modest compared to his former corporate position, he had found a measure of redemption in helping others learn from his spectacular mistake. Richard Blackwood had passed away 2 years earlier from a heart attack, but not before establishing a scholarship fund for veteran students pursuing business degrees. His final interview with Forbes magazine had been titled The Executive Who Learned Too Late, and his family had requested that his obituary include a public apology to Marcus Chen and an encouragement for business leaders to see potential instead of prejudice. The scholarship fund had grown to over $5 million through donations from business leaders who had been influenced by Richard's story of professional redemption. Each year, 20 veterans received full scholarships to pursue MBA degrees at top-tier business schools, with the requirement that they complete internships at companies participating in the Marcus Chen Foundation's Corporate Partnership Program. Harold Mitchell, now 72 and in excellent health, had become something of a celebrity in retirement for his role in recognizing Marcus's potential when others saw only problems. His memoir, Betting on Character: Why I Hired the Veteran Everyone Else Rejected, had topped business bestseller lists and been translated into 12 languages. The book's proceeds funded additional programs for veteran entrepreneurship education. Sarah Mitchell's consulting firm had evolved into a multinational organization specializing in unconventional talent identification. Her proprietary assessment methods, developed from lessons learned during Marcus's story, were being used by Fortune 500 companies to identify high-potential employees who might be overlooked by traditional recruiting practices. The firm's success rate had attracted clients in technology, healthcare, finance, and manufacturing sectors. The Marcus Chen Foundation had grown into one of the most influential veteran advocacy organizations in the country, with an annual budget exceeding $50 million and programs operating in all 50 states. The foundation's impact extended beyond business development to include mental health support, education assistance, and career transition programs that had helped over 100,000 veterans successfully integrate into civilian careers. Marcus's personal story had become a symbol of resilience and the power of standing up to prejudice, but he was most proud of the systematic changes that had resulted from that single evening of confrontation. The veteran unemployment rate had dropped to historic lows. Veteran-owned businesses were thriving at unprecedented rates, and corporate America had fundamentally changed its approach to recognizing military experience as a business asset. As he left the White House ceremony and walked through Lafayette Square, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with 3 corporate executives trying to humiliate him at a retirement party. Their attempt to destroy his dignity had instead created a platform that transformed the lives of hundreds of thousands of veterans and reshaped American business culture. The Marine who had been called unemployed and told to consider security work was now walking away from a ceremony where the president had just signed legislation that would impact veteran employment for generations to come. Sometimes the greatest victories begin with the courage to stand up when others try to tear you down, and the wisdom to transform that moment of confrontation into a lifetime of service to others who face similar challenges. The phone in his pocket buzzed with a text message from Harold Mitchell. "Proud of you, son. That retirement party was the best investment I ever made." Marcus smiled, knowing that the old executive's belief in potential over prejudice had changed not just his own life, but the lives of countless veterans who would benefit from the foundation built on the lessons learned that night in Seattle. 7 years after the retirement party that changed everything, Marcus Chen found himself standing before the United Nations General Assembly in New York, addressing world leaders about the global veteran employment crisis. The same man who had been dismissed as unemployed by corporate executives was now presenting research that would influence international policy on military veteran integration across 43 countries. Military veterans represent one of the world's most underutilized human resources, Marcus told the Assembly of Ambassadors, Ministers, and NGO leaders. Our research across 6 continents shows that countries with robust veteran entrepreneurship programs experience 23% higher economic growth rates and 18% lower rates of veteran suicide and homelessness. The presentation was the culmination of 3 years of international expansion for the Marcus Chen Foundation, which had established partnerships with veteran organizations in Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, Israel, and South Korea. Each country faced similar challenges in transitioning military personnel to civilian careers, and Marcus's model had proven adaptable across different cultural and economic contexts. In the gallery overlooking the General Assembly floor, Harold Mitchell sat with tears in his eyes as he watched his former protege address the world's most powerful leaders. Now 74, Harold had become Marcus's unofficial biographer, documenting the extraordinary expansion of a movement that had begun with a simple act of mentorship at a veteran job fair in Seattle. 7 years ago, I watched 3 executives try to humiliate this man at my retirement party, Harold had told a BBC documentary crew the previous month. Today, he's influencing global policy and transforming how entire nations think about veteran employment. Sometimes the most important investments we make are in people who don't fit conventional molds. The documentary, titled From Garage to Global, The Marcus Chen Story, had aired in 15 countries and sparked renewed interest in veteran entrepreneurship programs worldwide. Universities in London, Sydney, and Tokyo were establishing research centers focused on military to civilian career transitions, all based on methodologies developed by the Marcus Chen Foundation. Back in Seattle, the original Logisync headquarters had been transformed into the International Center for Veteran Innovation, a 200,000-square-foot facility that housed the Foundation's global operations, research laboratories, and training centers. The building's lobby featured a bronze statue of Harold Mitchell with an inscription reading, "To the executive who saw potential where others saw problems." The center attracted visitors from around the world, including government ministers, corporate executives, and military leaders seeking to understand how the Seattle model could be replicated in their own countries. The success stories emerging from these international programs were creating a new class of veteran entrepreneurs, whose innovations were addressing global challenges from climate change to healthcare delivery. Amanda Pierce, now Dr. Cardedom. Amanda Pierce had been appointed to lead the Foundation's International Research Division. Her work had evolved beyond studying bias in hiring practices to developing comprehensive frameworks for recognizing unconventional talent across cultural boundaries. Her research team included psychologists, economists, and former military personnel from 12 countries, creating the most comprehensive database of veteran career transition patterns ever assembled. The Marcus Chen story taught us that our assumptions about talent are often our greatest business liability, Dr. Pierce explained to a conference of European HR directors in Brussels. But the international data shows us that this isn't just an American problem. Every culture has its own version of the retirement party moment, where talent is dismissed based on superficial characteristics rather than actual capability. Jonathan Sterling's redemption arc had taken an international turn as well. His consulting practice had evolved into a global organization, specializing in corporate humility training and assumption management. His clients now included multinational corporations seeking to avoid the kind of cultural blind spots that had destroyed his own career at that fateful retirement party. His book, now in its 3rd edition and translated into 22 languages, had become required reading for international business students. The Harvard Business School had even created the Sterling Fellowship for students researching the cost of professional arrogance, turning Jonathan's failure into an educational tool that was preventing similar mistakes by the next generation of business leaders. The ripple effects of that single evening in Seattle had now reached every continent. In Tel Aviv, Former Israeli Defense Forces personnel were launching technology startups using funding models pioneered by the Chen Foundation. In London, the British government had established veteran business incubators in 40 cities based on the Seattle model. In Sydney, the Australian Parliament had passed legislation providing tax incentives for hiring veteran entrepreneurs, directly inspired by Marcus's policy recommendations. Marcus's personal life had evolved alongside his professional success. He had married Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a former Army psychiatrist who now served as the Foundation's director of mental health programs. Their 2 children, ages 4 and 6, had grown up understanding that their father's work was about helping people who had served their country find new ways to serve their communities. The family lived in the same Seattle neighborhood where Marcus had once worked construction jobs while developing Logisync in his garage. He had deliberately chosen to remain in the community that had supported his early success, and the local elementary school his children attended had been renamed the Harold Mitchell Elementary School in honor of the executive who had recognized potential where others saw problems. During quiet moments at home, Marcus would sometimes reflect on the extraordinary trajectory that had begun with such humiliation 7 years earlier. The corporate executives who had tried to destroy his dignity had instead created the catalyst for a global movement that was transforming how nations valued military service and recognized unconventional talent. The Foundation's annual report showed that veteran-owned businesses supported by their programs had now created over 50,000 jobs worldwide and generated more than $8 billion in economic activity. The mental health programs had helped reduce veteran suicide rates by 35% in participating communities, and the educational initiatives had enabled over 10,000 veterans to complete college degrees or professional certifications. But the statistics, impressive as they were, only told part of the story. The real impact was measured in individual lives transformed, families stabilized, and communities strengthened by the recognition that military experience represented a valuable asset rather than a hiring risk. As Marcus concluded his presentation to the United Nations and received a standing ovation from the international audience, he thought about the 3 executives who had confronted him at Harold's retirement party 7 years earlier. Their attempt to humiliate him had become the foundation for a global movement that was now influencing policy at the highest levels of government and creating opportunities for hundreds of thousands of veterans worldwide. The Marine who had been told he was unemployed and living in a fantasy was now standing before the world's most powerful leaders, proving that sometimes the greatest fantasies are the ones that become reality when someone has the courage to stand up for what they believe in. 8 years after that pivotal retirement party, tragedy struck when Harold Mitchell suffered a massive stroke while delivering a speech at the Seattle Veterans Museum. The 75-year-old executive, who had become the face of recognizing unconventional talent, was rushed to Harborview Medical Center where he spent 3 days in intensive care before passing away peacefully, surrounded by his family and the man he had considered his greatest professional achievement. Marcus Chen stood at the podium of St. Mark's Cathedral, looking out at the overflow crowd of 2,000 mourners who had come to pay their respects to the executive who had changed so many lives. The cathedral could barely contain the gathering that included 4 governors, dozens of CEOs, hundreds of veterans, and representatives from 12 countries where Harold's influence had sparked veteran employment programs. "Harold Mitchell didn't just mentor me," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. "He taught an entire generation of business leaders that our assumptions about people are often our greatest professional liability. He showed us that real leadership means recognizing potential in places where others see only problems." The funeral had become an international event, with delegations arriving from Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Germany to honor the man whose simple act of recognizing talent had sparked a global movement. The Australian Prime Minister had personally flown to Seattle, crediting Harold's influence on their national veteran employment policies for reducing their veteran unemployment rate by 60% over 5 years. In the front row, Sarah Mitchell sat with her 2 teenage children, watching as speaker after speaker described how her father's mentorship had transformed their lives and careers. The consulting firm she had built based on Harold's principles now employed 400 people across 8 countries, and the Harold Mitchell Institute for Talent Recognition at the University of Washington had become one of the world's leading research centers for studying unconventional hiring practices. Dr. Amanda Pierce, now 52 and recognized as the world's leading expert on workplace bias, delivered a eulogy that brought the congregation to tears. "Harold Mitchell gave me something I didn't deserve and hadn't earned," A second chance, she said, her voice breaking slightly. After I humiliated Marcus Chen at that retirement party 8 years ago, I thought my career was over. Harold could have written me off as another corporate casualty, but instead he encouraged me to study my own failure and use it to help others. Her research institute, funded by the Marcus Chen Foundation, had now trained over 50,000 HR professionals worldwide in recognizing unconscious bias and identifying overlooked talent. The economic impact of her work was estimated at over $30 billion in improved hiring decisions and reduced employee turnover across participating companies. Jonathan Sterling, now 48 and running a successful international consulting practice, spoke about Harold's influence on his own redemption journey. I was the Harvard MBA who thought credentials mattered more than character, he told the assembled mourners. Harold taught me that humility isn't weakness, it's the foundation of real leadership. His example gave me the courage to build a career helping other executives avoid the mistakes that nearly destroyed mine. The Jonathan Sterling Institute for Corporate Humility, established with proceeds from his best-selling memoir, now offered training programs for executive teams in 25 countries. The institute's motto, "Assumptions are the enemy of excellence," had become a widely recognized principle in international business education. Marcus's eulogy was the final address of the service, and his words would later be quoted in business schools and leadership seminars around the world. 8 years ago, Harold invited me to his retirement party as a gesture of kindness to a struggling veteran, Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's sound system. He never could have imagined that one evening would demonstrate so powerfully why our judgments about people matter more than our judgments about profit. The Marcus Chen Foundation had established the Harold Mitchell Memorial Scholarship, a $100 million endowment that would provide full university educations for 1,000 veterans annually. The scholarship recipients would be selected not based on traditional academic metrics, but on demonstrated leadership potential and innovative thinking, the same qualities Harold had recognized in Marcus 8 years earlier. Following the funeral, world leaders and business executives gathered at the Seattle Center for a reception that had evolved into an impromptu international conference on veteran employment and talent recognition. The conversations that took place that afternoon would lead to policy changes in 7 countries and the establishment of 3 new international research initiatives focused on unconventional hiring practices. The European Union announced plans to create a continent-wide veteran entrepreneurship program based on the Marcus Chen Foundation model. Japan committed to establishing veteran business incubators in 20 cities, and South Korea unveiled a comprehensive military-to-civilian transition program that would serve as a model for other nations in the Asia-Pacific region. But perhaps the most poignant moment of the day came when Marcus visited Harold's grave at Washelli Cemetery, accompanied by the 3 people whose lives had been most dramatically changed by that retirement party 8 years earlier. Dr. Amanda Pierce, Jonathan Sterling, and Marcus stood together in quiet reflection, each understanding that Harold's death marked the end of an era but not the end of his influence. He saw something in all of us that we couldn't see in ourselves, Amanda said quietly, placing flowers on the fresh grave. Even after we failed him, he never gave up on us. Marcus nodded, thinking about the extraordinary journey that had begun with Harold's simple decision to mentor a struggling veteran. The foundation that bore his name now operated in 15 countries, had helped create over 75,000 jobs, and had influenced policy at the highest levels of government worldwide. The Seattle Times would later describe Harold's funeral as the day the business world said goodbye to its conscience, but Marcus knew that Harold's real legacy wasn't in the tributes or the international recognition. It was in the tens of thousands of veterans who had found meaningful careers, the hundreds of thousands of families whose lives had been stabilized, and the fundamental change in how societies valued military service and recognized unconventional talent. As the sun set over Elliott Bay that evening, Marcus stood in his office looking out at the same view that had provided the backdrop for his humiliation 8 years earlier. Harold Mitchell was gone, but the movement he had started by recognizing potential in an unemployed veteran would continue transforming lives for generations to come. The retirement party that was supposed to honor Harold's career had instead become the foundation for his lasting legacy, proving that sometimes the most important thing a leader can do is see something in others that they cannot yet see in themselves. 10 years after the retirement party that changed everything, Marcus Chen stood before the largest gathering of veterans in American history. The National Mall in Washington, D.C. stretched endlessly before him, filled with over 500,000 veterans, their families, and supporters who had come to witness the dedication of the Harold Mitchell Memorial for Veteran Innovation. The bronze monument, standing 30 feet tall at the heart of the nation's capital, depicted Harold reaching out his hand to help a young veteran to his feet. A decade ago, a 65-year-old executive made a choice that would reshape how an entire nation thinks about military service, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the massive crowd through speakers positioned throughout the mall. Harold Mitchell didn't just hire veterans, he didn't just mentor them, he revolutionized the very concept of what it means to transition from military to civilian service. The dedication ceremony had drawn attendance that exceeded even the organizers' most optimistic projections. President Martinez, herself a former Navy officer, had declared the day a national holiday for veteran recognition. The crowd included not just American veterans, but delegations from the 47 countries where Harold's influence had sparked veteran employment programs. Marcus's own children, now 14 and 16, sat in the VIP section with their mother, Dr. Jennifer Chen, watching their father address what historians would later describe as the largest veteran advocacy gathering in world history. The teenagers had grown up understanding that their father's work was part of something larger than business success, that it was about dignity, respect, and the fundamental value of service to country. In the audience, 82-year-old Richard Blackwood sat in a wheelchair, his grandson helping him navigate the massive crowd. The former executive, now suffering from advanced Parkinson's disease, had become an unlikely advocate for veteran employment in his final years. His foundation, established with his remaining savings, had provided business training for over 1,000 disabled veterans, turning his moment of professional failure into a legacy of service. "I spent 30 years in corporate America making assumptions about people," Richard had told a Veterans Affairs conference the previous month, his voice shaking but determined. "It took one night of being completely wrong to teach me that character matters more than credentials." Harold Mitchell saw that truth from the beginning. Dr. Amanda Pierce, now 55 and serving as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Veteran Integration, had flown in from Geneva for the ceremony. Her work had evolved beyond academic research to direct policy influence at the international level. The Pierce Protocols for Veteran Employment, adopted by 38 countries, had become the global standard for military to civilian transition programs. "The retirement party incident taught me that bias isn't just wrong, it's economically devastating," she had testified before the UN General Assembly 6 months earlier. Countries that embrace veteran talent experience measurably higher economic growth, lower social costs, and stronger innovation ecosystems. Harold Mitchell understood this before any of us. Jonathan Sterling, now 51 and recognized as one of the world's leading experts on corporate humility, watched the ceremony from the media section where he was providing commentary for CNN International. His transformation from arrogant Harvard MBA to respected leadership consultant had become a case study taught in business schools worldwide. "This memorial represents more than honoring one man," Jonathan told the international television audience. "It represents the moment American business culture fundamentally changed its approach to recognizing talent." Harold Mitchell's legacy is measured not in profit margins but in human potential realized. The Marcus Chen Foundation, now operating in 63 countries with an annual budget exceeding $200 million, had become the world's largest veteran advocacy organization. The foundation's research had influenced policy in every G20 nation, and its entrepreneurship programs had created over 150,000 jobs globally while maintaining a 78% 5-year business survival rate. The statistics were staggering. Veteran unemployment in participating countries had dropped to historic lows. Veteran suicide rates had decreased by 45% in communities with active programs, and veteran-owned businesses were creating jobs at twice the rate of traditional startups. The economic impact was estimated at over $50 billion annually across all participating nations. But Marcus understood that the numbers only told part of the story. The real impact was in the individual lives transformed, the families stabilized, and the fundamental shift in how societies valued military service. The Harold Mitchell Memorial wasn't just honoring one executive's vision, it was celebrating a global recognition that veteran experience represented a strategic asset rather than a hiring risk. Sarah Mitchell, now 45 and running a multinational consulting empire built on her father's principles, delivered remarks that brought the massive crowd to its feet. "My father believed that potential was more important than pedigree, that character mattered more than credentials, and that recognizing talent in unexpected places was the highest form of leadership, she said, her voice strong despite the emotion of the moment. The Harold Mitchell Institute for Talent Recognition, now operating satellite campuses in 12 countries, had trained over 100,000 HR professionals in recognizing unconscious bias and identifying overlooked potential. The institute's research had influenced hiring practices at 70% of Fortune 500 companies and had been credited with improving workforce diversity and productivity across multiple industries. As the ceremony concluded with a flyover by military aircraft from 8 allied nations, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with such humiliation 10 years earlier. The corporate executives who had tried to destroy his dignity at Harold's retirement party had instead created the catalyst for a global movement that was now being honored at the highest levels of government. The memorial's inscription, visible to the hundreds of thousands gathered on the mall, read simply, "Harold Mitchell. He saw potential where others saw problems." Below it, a smaller plaque added, "In memory of the executive who proved that recognizing talent in unexpected places is the greatest investment any leader can make." The veteran, who had been called unemployed and told to consider security work, was now standing before the largest gathering of veterans in American history, speaking at the dedication of a national memorial to the man who had first recognized his potential. The fantasy that corporate executives had mocked 10 years earlier had become a reality that was transforming nations and changing how the world valued military service. As the crowd began to disperse and families gathered around the new memorial for photographs, Marcus knew that Harold's legacy would continue influencing policy and changing lives for generations to come. Sometimes the greatest monuments aren't built of bronze and stone, but of the lives transformed and the potential realized when someone has the courage to see value where others see only problems. 12 years after that life-changing retirement party, Marcus Chen received a phone call that would bring his extraordinary journey full circle. The caller was David Chen, a 24-year-old Marine veteran and recent graduate of the Harold Mitchell Institute for Veteran Innovation. Despite sharing a surname, David was no relation to Marcus, but his story would prove that Harold's legacy was creating new generations of veteran entrepreneurs who understood the power of recognizing potential in unexpected places. "Mr. Chen," David said, his voice carrying the same quiet confidence that Marcus had once used when addressing corporate executives who underestimated him. "I wanted to thank you personally before I announce my company's acquisition. 3 years ago, I was sleeping in my car in Portland, trying to convince investors to fund my renewable energy startup. Today, Tesla just acquired my technology for $1.2 billion. David's story was remarkably similar to Marcus's original journey, but with crucial differences that highlighted how much the business world had changed. Unlike Marcus, who had faced dismissive attitudes and corporate prejudice, David had found immediate support through the veteran entrepreneur network that now existed in every major city in America. The Marcus Chen Foundation had provided David's initial seed funding, the Harold Mitchell Institute had offered business development training, and the veteran entrepreneur community had connected him with mentors who understood both military experience and corporate innovation. What had taken Marcus years to achieve working in isolation, David had accomplished in 3 years with a comprehensive support system. "The difference between my experience and yours," David explained during their phone conversation, "is that I never had to prove that veterans could succeed in business. You already proved that for all of us. I just had to prove that my specific technology was valuable." Marcus smiled as he listened to David's story, understanding that this was exactly what Harold had envisioned 12 years earlier when he had first recognized potential in a struggling veteran. The movement that had begun with one executive's willingness to mentor had evolved into a comprehensive ecosystem that was identifying and developing veteran talent at unprecedented scale. The acquisition announcement made international headlines, not just because of the billion-dollar valuation, but because David Chen represented the 100th veteran entrepreneur whose company had achieved a valuation exceeding $100 million since the Marcus Chen Foundation had been established. The collective value of veteran-founded companies supported by the foundation now exceeded $50 billion, creating what economists were calling the Harold Mitchell effect on global innovation. Dr. Jennifer Chen, Marcus's wife and the foundation's director of mental health programs, had been tracking the psychological impact of this cultural transformation. Her research showed that veterans in communities with active entrepreneurship programs reported 60% higher life satisfaction scores and 70% lower rates of depression compared to veterans in areas without such support systems. Marcus's story taught us that when we change how society views veteran potential, we don't just create business opportunities. Dr. Chen explained to a conference of international mental health professionals, we fundamentally improve veteran well-being by providing purpose, community, and recognition for the unique skills military service develops. The ripple effects of David's success were already being felt across the veteran community. His company's headquarters in Portland had committed to hiring 200 veterans over the next 2 years, and his personal foundation was establishing renewable energy training programs for transitioning military personnel in 10 cities. Marcus's own children had grown into remarkable young adults who understood their father's work as part of a larger movement for social justice and economic opportunity. His daughter Elena, now 18 and headed to MIT to study engineering, had spent her senior year in high school developing an app that connected veteran job seekers with veteran-owned businesses. His son Michael, 16 and already showing entrepreneurial instincts, had started a nonprofit that provided business plan coaching for teenage children of military families. Dad never talks about what happened at that retirement party, Elena had told a local news reporter doing a feature on the Chen family. But I understand that someone tried to make him feel small, and instead of accepting that treatment, he turned it into something that helps hundreds of thousands of people. That's the kind of person I want to be. The Harold Mitchell Elementary School, located just blocks from where Marcus had once worked construction jobs while developing Logisync in his garage, had become a model for STEM education that specifically incorporated military family experiences. The school's innovative curriculum, developed with foundation support, was being replicated in school districts across the country. Sarah Mitchell, now serving as the foundation's international director, had been invited to deliver the keynote address at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where she would present research showing that countries with comprehensive veteran entrepreneur programs experienced measurably higher rates of innovation and economic growth. My father's story began with recognizing one veteran's potential, Sarah's prepared remarks stated. 12 years later, we've proven that veteran experience represents one of the world's most underutilized sources of innovation and leadership. The Harold Mitchell effect isn't just about individual success stories, it's about systematic transformation of how societies identify and develop human potential. The Foundation's annual report, released that same week, contains statistics that would have seemed impossible 12 years earlier. Over 200,000 veterans had received direct support through Foundation programs, creating more than 300,000 jobs and generating over $75 billion in economic activity across 68 countries. But perhaps the most significant measure of success was the cultural transformation that had occurred. The phrase veteran entrepreneur was no longer an oxymoron but a recognized category of business leadership. Military experience was increasingly viewed as valuable preparation for innovation and problem-solving rather than a barrier to corporate success. Marcus reflected on these developments as he prepared for a meeting with the Secretary of Defense to discuss expanding veteran entrepreneur programs to active duty personnel preparing for civilian transition. The conversation would focus on creating pathways for military personnel to develop business skills while still serving, ensuring an even smoother transition to civilian entrepreneurship. The Marine who had been called unemployed 12 years earlier was now advising the Pentagon on how to prepare the next generation of military personnel for civilian business success. The retirement party confrontation that was supposed to humiliate him had instead created a movement that was transforming how America and the world recognized military experience as a valuable business asset. As he walked into the Pentagon for his meeting, Marcus thought about Harold Mitchell and the simple act of recognition that had started everything. David Chen's success represented proof that Harold's vision was creating sustainable, generational change that would continue transforming lives long after the original participants were gone. 15 years after that retirement party that changed the world, Marcus Chen stood in the exact same ballroom at the Seattle Marriott where everything had begun. The elegant venue looked identical to that fateful evening, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over round tables draped in crisp white linens. But tonight, the energy was completely different. This wasn't a corporate retirement party. It was the Marcus Chen Foundation's 15th anniversary gala, and the 2,500 guests included presidents, prime ministers, Nobel laureates, and hundreds of veteran entrepreneurs whose lives had been transformed by the movement that started with one moment of courage. Marcus, now 53 with distinguished silver at his temples, walked slowly to the exact spot where Richard Blackwood, Jonathan Sterling and Amanda Pierce had cornered him 15 years earlier. He paused there, remembering the fear and humiliation he had felt as three corporate executives tried to destroy his dignity in front of Seattle's business elite. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom, 15 years ago tonight, in this exact location, three executives called me unemployed and told me to face reality. They said my garage startup was a fantasy, that veterans like me should stick to security work, and that I was embarrassing myself by pretending to be an entrepreneur. The crowd was absolutely silent, hanging on every word. Many of them knew the story, but hearing it told in the precise location where it happened created an electric atmosphere. What those executives didn't know, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger, was that they were about to catalyze the largest veteran empowerment movement in human history. He gestured to a massive screen that lit up behind him, displaying a world map covered in points of light. Each light represents a veteran-owned business supported by our foundation. Today, there are 847,000 points of light across 89 countries. The audience gasped as the numbers appeared on screen. $2.3 trillion in economic activity generated, 4.7 million jobs created. Veteran suicide rates reduced by 78% in participating communities. Over 500,000 veterans lifted out of poverty and homelessness. But here's what will truly amaze you, Marcus said, pausing for dramatic effect. The three executives who tried to humiliate me that night didn't just create this movement by accident. They taught us the most important lesson of all. The screen changed to show photos of Richard Blackwood, Jonathan Sterling, and Amanda Pierce from 15 years ago, then transitioned to show them today. Dr. Amanda Pierce is now the United Nations Secretary General for Human Development, having revolutionized how 1,905 countries identify and develop human potential. Her bias research has generated over $500 billion in improved productivity worldwide. The audience erupted in applause as Amanda, now 60, stood and waved from her table near the front. Jonathan Sterling's Institute for Corporate Humility has trained over 2 million executives in 120 countries, preventing countless careers from being destroyed by the same arrogance that nearly ended his own. His work has saved an estimated $200 billion in corporate productivity losses. Jonathan, now 56 and visibly emotional, stood to acknowledge the recognition, and Richard Blackwood, who passed away 5 years ago, spent his final decade establishing foundations that provided business training for over 50,000 disabled veterans. His last words to his family were an apology to me, and a request that veterans everywhere know that their service matters. The screen showed a video message from Richard's widow. Reading his final letter, Marcus Chen turned my worst moment into his greatest triumph. I spent my last years trying to honor the lesson he taught me, that our assumptions about people are often our greatest professional liability. I pray that other executives will learn from my mistake before it's too late. There wasn't a dry eye in the ballroom. Marcus's voice softened as he delivered the story's moral. The three people who tried to destroy me became my greatest teachers. They showed me that when someone tries to make you feel small, you have two choices. You can accept their judgment and become small, or you can use their doubt as fuel to become everything they said you could never be. He paused, looking directly into the cameras broadcasting the event live to 89 countries. But here's the real secret that those executives taught me. The people who underestimate you aren't your enemies. They're your greatest opportunity, because when you prove them wrong, you don't just change your own life, you change the world's understanding of what's possible. The screen behind him now displayed photos of thousands of veteran entrepreneurs, each accompanied by their success story. Every veteran who launches a business today stands on the foundation built by one evening of corporate humiliation 15 years ago. Every country that invests in veteran entrepreneurship does so because three executives made the mistake of judging a book by its cover. Marcus smiled, his eyes twinkling with the same quiet confidence that had emerged that night 15 years earlier. So to every veteran watching tonight who has been told they're not good enough, not qualified enough, not corporate enough, remember this: your doubters aren't predicting your future, they're funding it. Every time someone underestimates you, they're investing in your eventual triumph. The ballroom erupted in a standing ovation that lasted 7 minutes. People were crying, cheering, and holding their phones high to capture this moment of pure inspiration, but Marcus wasn't finished. And to every executive, every hiring manager, every person in a position to recognize talent, remember Harold Mitchell. Remember that the person you dismiss today might be the person who changes your industry tomorrow. The veteran you overlook might be the entrepreneur who revolutionizes your business model. The quiet professional you underestimate might be the leader who transforms your entire understanding of what success looks like. He paused one final time, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying clearly through the sound system. 15 years ago, 3 executives tried to humiliate me at a retirement party. Tonight, I want to thank them. Because they taught the world the most important lesson any of us can learn. Your character isn't defined by how people treat you, it's defined by how you respond when they treat you badly. The screen behind him went black except for one simple message in white letters. Never let anyone make you feel small. You were born to do great things. As Marcus left the podium to thunderous applause, he walked past the exact spot where his journey had begun. The unemployed veteran who had been told to face reality had just addressed a global audience of millions, proving that sometimes the greatest realities are the ones we create when we refuse to accept other people's limitations. The retirement party that was supposed to end Harold Mitchell's career had instead launched a movement that transformed the world. And the 3 executives who tried to humiliate a struggling veteran had accidentally catalyzed the largest veteran empowerment initiative in human history. Sometimes the most powerful moments of your life begin when someone tries to make you feel powerless. Sometimes your greatest triumph starts with your deepest humiliation. And sometimes the people who doubt you the most become the foundation for your most impossible dreams. The moral of the story was simple but profound. When life gives you doubters, give the world proof that they were wrong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.